She wasn't just a queen. She was the woman who turned royal incest from a dirty secret into a political weapon and planted the dark seeds that would ultimately bring down Egypt's most powerful dynasty. This is the story behind one of history's most twisted dynasties and the dark secrets that even the real Cleopatra could never outrun. In the marble halls of ancient Alexandria, where philosophers debated the nature of virtue and mathematicians calculated the circumference of the earth, a young princess learned a lesson that would haunt not just her own lifetime, but the future of an entire civilization, that power comes not from wisdom or morality, but from surviving the unthinkable. This is not the story of ancient glory or scholarly achievement. This is the hidden history of how one woman's personal trauma became state policy, how private horrors were transformed into royal tradition, and how the greatest dynasty of the ancient world engineered its own destruction through the normalization of royal incest. A truth so dark, so disturbing, that many historians preferred to speak of it only in whispers, and that the glittering facade of Cleopatra's allure could never fully erase. Queen Arsinoe II didn't merely break taboos, she institutionalized them, leaving behind a legacy that would poison the Ptolemaic bloodline for centuries. Her story forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality that sometimes the most influential figures in history aren't visionaries or heroes, but deeply damaged individuals whose private demons reshape entire civilizations. Born into a world where daughters were political currency, where family ties meant nothing compared to the ruthless calculus of power, Arsinoe transformed her own suffering into a weapon so potent it would outlive her by centuries. Her life reads like a Greek tragedy written in blood and ambition, a drama in which the victim becomes the perpetrator, and survival demands embracing the very horrors that once destroyed you. And the question that echoes across the centuries is this: when trauma becomes power, how many must bleed to keep one person safe? In the glittering haze of ancient Alexandria, a city where the scent of salt from the Mediterranean mingled with the dust of papyrus scrolls and the whispers of philosophers, power was currency and secrets were worth far more than gold. This city wasn't merely a jewel of architecture and learning, it was the beating heart of an empire carved from the corpse of Alexander the Great's ambitions. And it was here that the dark secrets of ancient queens and the seeds of Egypt's ultimate downfall were quietly sown. The year was roughly 316 BCE. Alexander was dead. The man who had stormed the known world and reshaped history in less than a decade lay in a foreign tomb, his empire shattered like a stained glass window dropped on marble. In the bloody vacuum, he left behind his generals known to history as the Diadochi, or successors tore into each other, each clawing for a piece of his legacy. Endless wars raged across territories, staining the earth red from the Aegean to the banks of the Nile. From this chaos rose a figure whose ambition was matched only by his political cunning, Ptolemy the Soter, one of Alexander's most trusted commanders. Ptolemy seized Egypt as his personal prize and crowned himself pharaoh, building a dynasty that would last almost 3 centuries, a dynasty destined to become one of history's most twisted and controversial bloodlines. It was under his rule that Alexandria became a crucible of knowledge and power, home to the great library and a melting pot where Greek philosophy intertwined with the ancient mysticism of the Egyptian gods. On the surface, it seemed a shining beacon of civilization, a place where scholars calculated the circumference of the earth and poets wrote verses praising both Zeus and Osiris. But beneath that marble sheen, the Ptolemaic court was a dark labyrinth of intrigue, betrayal, and hidden history. Royal blood was both blessing and curse. Power was guarded with paranoia. Alliances were sealed with marriages, and royal incest was not merely tolerated, it became a tool. The pharaohs of Egypt had long claimed divine status, marrying sisters to replicate the sacred unions of gods like Isis and Osiris. Yet for the Ptolemies, this wasn't purely religion. It was a ruthless strategy to keep foreign bloodlines from staking claims to the throne and to ensure no rival prince could seize power through marriage alliances. In this world, daughters weren't daughters. They were political currency bargaining chips, traded in a brutal game where family ties were as fragile and as dangerous as the edge of a sharpened blade. And the question that loomed over the marble halls was simple and chilling. How far would a dynasty go to protect its throne, even if it meant devouring itself from within. It was into this world, this palace of shadows and secrets, that Arsinoe II was born. And what she witnessed in her earliest years would not only shape her destiny, but ultimately the fate of an entire civilization. She was born into a palace of gold and marble, and into a cage forged from shadows and secrets. From the moment Arsinoe II opened her eyes to the world, she was more than a daughter. She was a potential weapon, a bargaining chip, a piece on a chessboard drenched in royal blood. And in the dark corridors of the Ptolemaic court, where whispers carried the weight of death, a child's innocence could become the first casualty in a war for power. Arsinoe entered life as the daughter of Ptolemy, Soter and Berenice, a union meant to secure alliances and stabilize a fragile throne. To the outside world, she was a princess of unmatched pedigree, part of the dynasty that would eventually give rise to Cleopatra the Queen, whose very name has become synonymous with seduction and destruction. But behind the shimmering facade of Alexandria's splendor lay the dark secrets of ancient queens that even the real Cleopatra story could not fully eclipse. From her earliest days, Arsinoe would have witnessed the brutal dance of power that played out daily within the royal court. Executions whispered behind heavy curtains. Goblets laced with poison passed like casual greetings. Courtiers who smiled one day disappeared the next. And above all loomed the chilling reality that in the Ptolemaic dynasty, family ties were simultaneously the greatest bond and the greatest threat, a truth that shaped not just politics, but the very core of Arsinoe's soul. Ancient sources speak in careful, guarded language of what might have happened behind those palace walls. Historians like Plutarch and Strabo hint at unspeakable acts committed by Ptolemy I, cloaking dark realities and euphemisms that barely concealed the horror. Excessive affection is how some chroniclers chose to describe a father's attention that crossed boundaries no child should ever have to fear. Modern scholars, piecing together fragments of gossip, psychological profiles, and patterns of later behavior, see in Arsinoe's future decisions the unmistakable fingerprints of early trauma. It was here in a gilded prison that Arsinoe learned her most devastating lesson, that survival often demands sacrificing one's own humanity. And in a palace where love could become a weapon, trust was a luxury no royal child could afford. But even as she endured horrors that would have broken most, the young princess began to observe, to memorize, to transform pain into knowledge. Because in the Ptolemaic dynasty, trauma wasn't just a scar, it was a tool. And as Arsinoe stepped into womanhood, the very darkness that nearly consumed her would become the fire she wielded to seize power in the most shocking way imaginable, a path that would lead her into the arms of a man old enough to be her grandfather, and into a marriage that was nothing short of another royal scandal waiting to explode. Arsinoe II was barely 15 when she was led, draped in royal silks and glittering jewels, into the arms of a man old enough to be her grandfather, a man whose name, Lysimachus, carried the weight of both military triumph and whispered terror. For the world looking on, it was simply another political marriage, a necessary sacrifice to secure alliances and keep the fragile mosaic of the Hellenistic kingdoms from shattering further. But behind the ceremonial veils and perfumed incense, the reality was far darker. Arsinoe was being traded like currency, her innocence the price of power. Lysimachus, one of Alexander the Great's former generals, was a ruler already seasoned by wars and betrayals. His face was etched with scars, his gaze perpetually sharp, as though perpetually searching for hidden daggers in the shadows. Though history remembers him as a formidable strategist, the palace remembered him differently, as a man consumed by cruelty, a ruler whose paranoia grew in tandem with his advancing years. And so Arsinoe, barely more than a child, found herself trapped between two monsters: the father who had violated the most sacred trust, and a husband who saw her not as a partner, but as a vessel to produce heirs for his increasingly unstable throne. In the palace of Lysimachus, Arsinoe learned quickly that silence was safer than truth, that a well-timed smile could mean the difference between survival and destruction. She watched her new husband execute his own son from a previous marriage on nothing more than a whispered accusation of treason, a scene that left splatters of royal blood across marble floors and carved into Arsinoe's mind a truth she would never forget. Morality is a luxury only the powerful can afford. And even then, they rarely do. But even as she endured nights of fear and days of forced smiles, Arsinoe was not merely a victim. Somewhere inside her, amid the bruises and whispered prayers for escape, a seed of transformation began to sprout. She started to observe, to listen, to piece together the hidden currents of the court. Because in the world of ancient queens, knowledge was power, and survival depended on knowing when to strike and when to vanish like smoke. And so, in a foreign court, far from the marble libraries of Alexandria, Arsinoe began her metamorphosis. She was learning how to trade secrets as currency, how to weave alliances with a glance, how to mask every flicker of fear beneath the serene mask of a royal consort. Her marriage to Lysimachus produced 3 sons, a fragile hope of legacy. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Arsinoe might carve out a sliver of peace amid the chaos. But the wars of the Diadochi were relentless, like an ancient tide that swallowed thrones and shattered dynasties without mercy. And when Lysimachus fell in battle in 281 BCE, Arsinoe found herself standing at a crossroads, a widow, the mother of royal sons, surrounded by men who viewed her as both a prize to be seized and a threat to be neutralized. What she chose next would shock the Hellenistic world and transform her from a silent victim into one of history's most formidable architects of power. Because Arsinoe II was about to prove that trauma could become the sharpest blade in any royal arsenal. It didn't happen in a single night, nor did it come in a flood of rage or madness. The transformation of Arsinoe II from a girl trapped between monsters into a woman who would bend an entire dynasty to her will was the work of slow poison drip by calculated drip. Each small betrayal she witnessed, each flicker of a blade in a darkened hallway, each whispered plot that sent another noble to an early grave carved away at whatever innocence remained in her, until all that was left was a diamond-hard core of survival and ambition. In the brutal court of Lysimachus, Arsinoe learned the first of many dark secrets about how power truly functioned in the ancient world. She saw how truth could be a liability, how loyalty was a mask worn until it became inconvenient. And she understood that in a royal palace, secrets weren't merely dangerous, they were currency more precious than gold. To survive in a dynasty increasingly defined by scandal, bloodshed, and the hidden history of abuse, she had to become something more than a frightened girl. She had to become a player. So she began to cultivate allies, servants who owed her favors, courtiers who craved the security that only proximity to the royal family could bring. She listened more than she spoke. She observed the subtle shifts of body language, the tremors in a voice, the slight twitch of a hand on a dagger's hilt. And she learned to hide her own fear behind a mask of serene composure that would later become one of her deadliest weapons. By the time she reached 20, Arsinoe was no longer just the silent consort of an aging king. She was a master of palace intrigue. She could spot betrayal before it hatched. She maneuvered conversations like a general shifting troops across a battlefield. She understood that in a world dominated by power and trauma, it was safer to be feared than pitied. And that morality was a fragile luxury that rulers could not afford. Her marriage to Lysimachus had produced 3 sons, and for a fleeting moment she almost believed she might secure a quiet life away from blood-soaked plots. But the wars of the Diadochi showed no mercy. When Lysimachus fell in battle in 281 BCE, Arsinoe was cast adrift, once more a royal widow, with royal sons, each boy a potential pawn in someone else's game, or a threat to a rival's claim to power. And it was here in the ashes of her husband's kingdom that Arsinoe made a decision that would shock the Hellenistic world, because she wasn't going to simply survive. She was going to rise, and she would do it by binding her fate and her body to the very throne she'd once feared. The next chapter of her life would see her marry not a foreign king but her own blood, her brother Ptolemy II. And in that choice, she would shatter what little remained of the line between victim and perpetrator and set Egypt on a path toward one of history's most twisted dynasties. The news sent shock waves through the marble corridors of the Hellenistic world. Arsinoe II, the widowed queen, the survivor of 2 monsters, was returning to Egypt, and she would not come alone. For this time, she was carrying not merely the weight of her past, but a plan that would transform both her destiny and the fate of Egypt forever. She intended to marry her own brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and in doing so, she would ignite one of history's most notorious royal incest scandals, a scandal whose dark secrets would echo all the way to the real Cleopatra story centuries later. To the outside world, the union was unthinkable, even in an age where power often trampled morality. Where dynasties rose and fell on the tip of a sword, the idea of a queen marrying her brother crossed lines many believed sacred. But to Arsinoe, lines were illusions, boundaries only existed to be broken, and family ties were tools to be wielded. She saw an opportunity where others saw taboo, a chance to consolidate power so completely that no foreign prince, no ambitious general could ever challenge the throne through marriage alliances. Because if royal marriages were kept entirely within the family, no outsider could claim a drop of royal blood. And so she set her plan into motion. When Arsinoe arrived in Alexandria, she found a court already simmering with tension. Ptolemy II was married to Arsinoe, a woman whose presence represented both a political alliance and an obstacle. Arsinoe II wasted no time. With a deadly combination of flattery, manipulation, and the shared scars of their childhood, she wrapped her brother in a web of loyalty and guilt. She whispered secrets into his ears, reminded him of the hidden history of trauma they both carried, and convinced him that only together, brother and sister, ruler, could they secure Egypt's throne. Then came the final blow. Arsinoe II helped engineer accusations of treason against Arsinoe I, fabricating charges so convincing that Ptolemy had no choice but to exile his own wife. The queen was gone. The path was clear, and in a spectacle that stunned even the cynical courts of the Hellenistic world, Ptolemy II married his own sister and crowned her not merely as consort, but as co-ruler. From that moment on, the Ptolemaic dynasty became not only a monarchy, but a theater of scandal where the sacred bonds of family twisted into instruments of raw political power. Coins were minted showing the two siblings side by side, equal in size and prominence, their profiles etched into silver like twin deities. Arsinoe took the title Philadelphus sibling lover and wore it like armor against the judgment of gods and men. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was an architect of a new world order where royal incest was not a shameful secret, but an official policy, a doctrine that would reshape Egypt's royal bloodline for centuries to come. And as she ascended the throne beside her brother-husband, Arsinoe began to wield power in ways no queen before her had dared, a power that would ripple through temples, treasuries, and armies, and that would soon institutionalize incest as both a divine command and a political shield. It was here that the transformation of trauma into governance reached its zenith, a story that would only grow darker as Arsinoe set her sights on ruling not from behind the throne, but as an equal sovereign of one of history's most twisted dynasties. Arsinoe II did not return to Egypt merely to stand beside a throne. She came back to sit upon it, and the woman who once cowered in darkened halls learning to swallow screams and bury terror behind downcast eyes now stepped into the searing light of power. She demanded to be more than Ptolemy II's consort. She demanded to be his equal. And the kingdom of Egypt would soon discover that when a survivor becomes a ruler, she can turn her wounds into weapons that reshape empires. From the first day of her reign as co-sovereign, Arsinoe moved swiftly like a blade sliding between ribs. Coins from this era bore not just Ptolemy's image, but Arsinoe's too, each profile equal in size and prominence, a silent declaration that Egypt was now governed by the sibling gods. Official decrees carried both their names. Her presence in state councils was not ceremonial. She issued orders, reorganized finances, and influenced military appointments. And always in every edict and public appearance, there lay an unspoken message: the queen is no longer content to hide in the shadows. But Arsinoe's ambition reached further than silver coinage or royal titles. She set out to institutionalize incest, not merely as a tolerated sin, but as the very bedrock of royal legitimacy. She wove it into the fabric of religion, politics, and national identity. Priests were ordered to craft hymns praising the sacred love between brother and sister, to recite prayers invoking Isis and Osiris, the divine siblings who were both lovers and co-rulers. The cult of the sibling gods was born, and it spread through temples like an intoxicating perfume, transforming what many viewed as an abomination into a symbol of divine right. It was a masterstroke of propaganda, a dark secret rebranded as holy doctrine. Because under Arsinoe's vision, incest was not merely a private indulgence, it became state policy. It served a dual purpose, reinforcing the dynasty's claim to semi-divine status and locking royal blood inside an impenetrable fortress where no foreign prince could ever stake a claim through marriage. Royal incest ensured the purity of the bloodline and the absolute power of the ruling siblings. Yet behind this brilliant maneuvering lay a chilling reality. Arsinoe was institutionalizing the very horrors that had once destroyed her. Her policies planted seeds of genetic decay and moral corruption that would grow into poisonous fruit in the generations to come. And though Egypt for a time flourished under her iron will, its economy strengthened, its libraries expanded, its trade routes secure, the dynasty was quietly sowing the roots of its own destruction. Because every temple hymn, every silver coin, every festival in honor of the sibling gods concealed a terrifying truth that the throne of Egypt was now built upon the legacy of a woman who had learned to survive by sacrificing every boundary, even those that separated blood from blood. And as Arsinoe tightened her grip on the kingdom, the glittering marble of Alexandria could not hide the shadows gathering in its corridors, shadows that would soon reveal the devastating price Egypt would pay for one queen's quest to turn trauma into power. For a time it seemed as though Arsinoe II's vision had triumphed. The royal coffers swelled with taxes collected from distant provinces. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean with caravans carrying spices, ivory, and papyrus to the gates of Alexandria. Scholars flocked to the great library, their quills scratching secrets onto scrolls that would echo through history. Egypt shimmered like a jewel under the twin reign of the sibling gods. But beneath that brilliance, a rot was quietly spreading, a rot seeded by Arsinoe's most dangerous legacy, the institutionalization of incest. Royal incest was more than scandal. It was a genetic time bomb. Each generation that followed Arsinoe and Ptolemy II became more fragile physically and mentally. Modern genetic studies of Ptolemaic mummies have confirmed what ancient whispers feared. The dynasty suffered from severe inbreeding depression. Hemophilia bled royal bodies dry. Club feet twisted princely steps. Severe scoliosis warped royal spines. And behind the marble masks of queens and kings lurked the shadow of mental instability, a legacy of paranoia, cruelty, and deep psychological scars that made every successor more dangerous than the last. Ptolemy III, the son of Arsinoe II, and Ptolemy II still ruled with relative competence. But the seeds of destruction had already been sown. By the time Ptolemy IV took the throne, the dynasty was unraveling from within. Ancient chroniclers described him as cruel, debauched a ruler who drowned his palace in feasts and spilled his own kin's blood on suspicion alone. His successor Ptolemy V ascended the throne as a child surrounded by factions ready to tear the kingdom apart. And so the once mighty Ptolemaic dynasty, born from the genius of Alexander's generals, devolved into a house of twisted secrets and royal scandal, a dynasty whose collapse became inevitable. And at the end of this poisonous lineage stood Cleopatra VII, the woman the world remembers for her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, for her beauty and for her tragic end. But even Cleopatra's legendary allure could not mask the truth that she was the final bloom on a tree whose roots were poisoned long before her birth. Coins from her reign show a woman with pronounced features, possibly the physical echoes of generations of inbreeding. And historians have often wondered whether her desperate political maneuvers were not just strategy, but the actions of a queen trying to save a dynasty already rotting from within. Because while Rome's legions may have dealt the final blow, the real assassin of the Ptolemaic dynasty was Arsinoe's own doctrine, a doctrine that traded the bloodline's health for the illusion of eternal power. And the question that lingers like incense smoke over the ruins of Alexandria is this: how many generations must pay the price for the trauma of a single queen? As the dynasty stumbled towards its bloody finale, Egypt, once the jewel of the ancient world, became a cautionary tale about how hidden truths of ancient queens, when fused with absolute power, can echo across centuries. And it is in that echo that we must seek to understand the final haunting chapters of Arsinoe's story. History remembers queens draped in silk and gold, seated on thrones carved from ivory, their names immortalized in stone. But the story of Arsinoe II forces us to confront a darker truth that sometimes the monsters who shape history were once innocent children crushed beneath the weight of secrets and power. That trauma left untreated doesn't merely vanish, it metastasizes, twisting love into manipulation and family into a battlefield. Arsinoe survived horrors that would have shattered most souls. She turned pain into strategy, transformed personal violation into state policy. And in doing so, she laid the foundation for one of history's most twisted dynasties, a dynasty whose bloodline secrets would eventually drown Egypt in madness, betrayal, and Rome's conquering shadow. Yet even as we recoil from the darkness of her choices, we must also acknowledge a terrifying possibility that any society ignoring trauma can unwittingly breed its own destroyers. Because hidden wounds rarely stay hidden. They find new ways to surface in politics, in families, in the quiet corridors of power. So, here's the question. We must all face echoing across the marble ruins of Alexandria. Can we break the cycle before trauma turns us into the very monsters we fear? If this hidden history of ancient queens has made you think or left you stunned, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you see Arsinoe as a villain or as a tragic survivor? Let's talk about it. And if you want more deep dives into the dark secrets and untold stories that shaped empires and that still shape us, today hit the like button, save this video for later, and subscribe so you won't miss what history has been hiding all along. Because sometimes the past isn't past at all. It's alive in us. And the real Cleopatra story, the truth about ancient queens like Arsinoe II, is that their choices still ripple through our world, asking us the same question over and over again. How far would you go to survive?